Hi all, good morning to those joining in the US, and good afternoon and night for those in Europe and Asia. We have people from Europe and Asia at this time, so welcome all and thanks for the effort of either staying late and being with us. My name is Diego May, Chief Revenue Officer at InOrbit, and I want to welcome you to this fireside chat about logistics and robotics. As you know, InOrbit provides an operations infrastructure layer for companies scaling their robot fleets. We work with companies in different industries when fleets start to grow from initial pilots to scaling deployments. Logistics is one of the verticals where there is and there will continue to be a lot of traction. That is why I'm particularly excited about this conversation that we're gonna hear now between Florian and Per. And before I pass it on to Florian, I want to remind you all that we will get to the Q&A session at the end. So please use the chat function to ask all the questions you want, and we will gather them to be sure that we answer them all at the end, or if we don't answer them all, we're going to follow up via email afterwards. Let me now pass it on to Florian.
First of all, thank you so much for joining us. For everyone who hasn't met Per, he's been in tech for over 25 years. He's been an advocate for digitization or digitalization, depending on what side of the pond you're in. And he's worked at AOL, at Microsoft, DHL, startups. So he's really been all over the place. Also in the world, he's lived in Laos, Thailand, New Zealand, Germany, and now in the Faroe Islands, which I actually had to look up to make sure that it's part of the Danish Commonwealth. So really a very interesting life. And at DHL, he helped execute the digital strategy for everything from mail services to supply chain, warehouse automation, and he had a key role in the robotics hub. So I think we're super happy to have him today. Per is now working on a slightly different area, like a very worthwhile area around H-Tech and digital health. But he's got all this accumulated knowledge. So Per, welcome. I don't know if I messed up the intro. Anything you want to add to that?
No, thank you so much, Florian. I mean, I think you forgot the United States, where I spend most of my time as well. But anyway, yeah, no, thank you so much. Great to be here, and appreciate the intro. I think you said the thing about digitization, and I said in my LinkedIn little announcement that digitization is a very human way to do business, and I mean, it's kind of, we call it digitalization and we talk about technology, but really digitalization means ones and zeros, and it's that fundamental thing that sort of goes through life, that you try something out, and if it works, you carry on, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't. You stop doing it, and that's what we do in the tech business, and always done. And now other parts of business are discovering this great way of working. If you look at the industrialization, for example, we sat down and then we decided the whole process, and then we told humans fit into this process, or if you don't, die or get fired. And that's not human, right? So we finally reached the place in which I'm super excited to be part of, and thank you for letting me be part of this webinar with you guys. So
awesome. And you talked about digitization being moving ones and zeros, but you worked at a place, DHL, where you moved more than ones and zeros. You moved a lot of goods around the world. So and I think we've seen even over the last year and a half, but even longer, this acceleration in the need for logistics. Yeah. Everything from consumer expectations changing, this expectation of like instant delivery, magical transmission of goods, e-commerce growing and taking over retail, labor market shifts. So how do you see all of these major changes impacting both the big players as well as the smaller players in the space?
I moved from Microsoft over to DHL, Deutsche Post DHL, and it's going from a software company over to a process company, and that's a huge change. I mean, that was a pivot that really took a lot of different aspects. And logistics and supply chain is one of the most exciting industries, right? Because it's essentially, I call it the the operation system of society, right? It's without that, society will break apart. And we saw that wonderfully now, well, during the horrible pandemic, but we saw again that supply chain kept humans being able to feed ourselves at least and live. And now we're delivering vaccinations and medicine and other crucial supplies around the world. Now we have come to a perfect storm right now in the whole supply chain, and we all know about that with the chip sorters and all sorts of stuff. And it's, you know, this just in demand or just production has reached this limit. We do need to have some sort of buffers in the system, and automation is the key to all of this, right? So we come to a point, I mean, if you think of it, where logistics supply chains started like 10 years ago, e-commerce was starting to really take off, but the existing systems could actually carry it, right? There wasn't too much, there wasn't enough push on it. The existing supply chains were able to take care of it. There wasn't a need for a massive change. And as we sort of the whole thing started pushing and demand increased, the supply side of it, which means the logistics companies and the supply chain companies, were all of a sudden, whoa, we cannot hire more people because there isn't any more people at this stage. And kind of in a way that, you know, you sort of like, oh, wow, you know, the demand is going like this, but the resources and availability is going flat. You know, what can you do? And we know from history, and I'm in the business now, as you said, in age tech and health tech, and we have the same issue of resources. We had the same issue in 1798, where humans were outgrowing pace production of food, and Malthus said, you know, oh, you know, we're all going to die, or the poor people are going to die. And of course, he was wrong, because technology helped food production to go in front of the curve. And just the same thing has just happened in logistics. We are able, through technology, to keep that curve in the front. And it's so fascinating to see how we are able to do that. And automation is absolutely key in all of that. But it's never, I think a lot of the discussions, and particularly when you go, because logistics and supply chain has been very human capital until now. And in that approach, people have been thinking so intensively about that, and all the P&L, every warehouse manager has their own P&L, right? And they've been thinking about that. The biggest risk to their business plans were the cost of employees, as well as the availability of employees. And through the last couple of years, the employees have also learned, hey, I need the automation to help me get my job better. And a very fascinating thing, and if we look at all industries, whether it's music industry, travel, whatever it is, every single time we go in and digitize it, there's a clear disruption in the beginning, because the business model changes fundamentally. But when it changes, what happens is that, you know, you get new ways of doing things, and all of a sudden people flush into that industry because it's now actually attractive to work in logistics and supply chain, you know, even at all levels. And we see that it still has a lot, like, I mean, we read about what's going on with Amazon and the warehouse workers, but at the same time, we also see that without the automation, we couldn't, like, the volumes wouldn't be possible. So I think, you know, we actually, with it as well, we get a bunch of new startups, we get the investments from the investment community. Like, the last 5 years has seen a phenomenal increase in investment in the whole supply chain and logistics startup world. I mean, it's just 6 years ago, it was like less than, you know, we're talking $1 billion in VC funding, and now we're talking 80, you know,
so
easily.
I think you make a really good point about, you know, how when digitization comes in, it results in disruption. Like, for example, if we look at the music space, right?
Yeah.
So I can barely remember what it was like before Spotify, right? And it's like, okay, you had to have these shiny discs that you had
What's
to
an LP?
insert.
Yeah.
You didn't have like a playlist that played on forever, and you didn't have access to all the music or almost all the music in the world. And going back seems, you know, seems crazy. And I think we're about to see that in logistics. You talked about how the last 5 years already saw a lot of changes in automation, and we know also that automation means different things to different people.
Yeah.
You know, in some cases it's a simple conveyor belt, all the way to, you know, full autonomous mobile robots operating. So I'd love to ask you to pull out your crystal ball and then tell me what you think is in store for the next 5 years.
I think this is I think, you know, I've entered the field now of health, digital health, because it's been a passion of mine, and I've been doing that for a long time too. But I think the logistics and supply chain space is one of the most exciting businesses right now in terms of tech and that automation. And you're so right. I think, you know, if you look at the Alibaba and the Amazon model, they essentially have one business model really, and they're doing one thing, and so they're able to get away with scaling one type of robots, or one you know, they have multi robots, don't get me wrong, and they're able to do, they're multiplying this. But if you look at 3PLs like DHL and others, then you see them, they having to cater for all sorts of customers, right? You know, they have many times they have 2 customers in every warehouse, right? And so, or 3, and they have to deal with multiple, several hundred different warehouse management systems. They're not at the luxury of Amazon that's using theirs and it's all one homogenic, beautiful, one simple. I mean, don't get me wrong, they have their own challenges. I know this from friends that work there, but at the same time, I think, you know, how do you then create a world and use the benefit of robotics and automation? And a good example, like, you know, the perfect automated warehouse. I mean, how many have we not seen of these? And we also see that they come short because all of a sudden it's like, you now have to do, instead of a 6-pack, you now have to do a 12-pack of beer, for example, or, you know, or you go over and then your warehouse it's not food anymore they actually deliver car parts, which are much bigger and heavier. And so you can't, like, if you're just in one space, you can do this. And I think Amazon and Alibaba, we know they've executed very well in this. But for the rest of the world, and, you know, the market is huge. You know, we think of these markets. I mean, the logistics supply chain is over, what is it right now, $12 trillion market cap, right? It's you know, it's between 10 and 12, and it's just, you know, that in order for you to optimize your organization, you have to think about, you can have a warehouse where you have a life science customer, you can't really have a car in the same, but you can have other things. You can have e-commerce, depending, you have separation. You can have all sorts of different customers in that warehouse. And that was sort of like the big challenge for us at DHL, was like, how do we then cater for them? And that's why we came up with what now is called the Robotic Hub, and which my team started on before before that. And how do you create that kind of environment where you have multiple different kinds of robots? And you do. I mean, if you go to a production site, you go to any car manufacturer, you go to Unilever or any of these guys, they will have multiple robots, and they use different kinds and all the time. But they have one operation system. Now you have to go one step above that and say, well, most warehouses don't have that. Like, they have to operate multiple warehouses depending on who the customer is. Some customers come with their own warehouse management systems, so you have to use this. Others, they say, we use our own, you know, and then you get the robots coming in trying to help. And I think you see the next 5 years, to answer your question, the next 5 years, you're going to see the same conversion that we've seen in other industries, which have led to if you think of the e-commerce space, right? When they started, they were, you know, very simple platforms. Now you need, if you are going to make, and I'm, you know, a mate of mine is building a platform right now. I mean, he's using Shopify, right? Because Shopify takes all the bits and pieces he needs. He needs billing, he needs all the ordering, he needs the refunding, and all that sort of stuff. In the early days of e-commerce, you had to set all that up yourself. And you could go and become a seller on Amazon, and they would give it to you. But if you were serious about your business today, you wouldn't do that, right? You would create it yourself, but you got to use somebody's software, and somebody's got to do that for automation as well. And that's one of the missing links, which I think next 5 years, you're going to see more of that kind of systems that, you know, my automation, some of it will be robots, some of it will be conveyor belts, some of it will be humans. And it's really going to be crucial. If you are in that logistics and supply chain business, you need to figure out how to optimize that. And the shortage we're seeing right now in chips and other things, it comes out of the fact that we have optimized the supply chain to a world that is no longer, right? So now the world is changing because of the pandemic, because of the globalization is changing, and the patterns of humans are changing. And as that happens, you need, in the logistics supply chain, you need to be ready for that taking. And to do that, you have to be able to have some system that supplies, enables you to do things quickly, incorporate a new type of robot, take one out, get other ones in. You're not going to have a holistic robotic fleet. Nobody believes that.
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of customers, and I think we've seen three themes emerge pretty consistently across the board: flexibility, resilience, and labor are the things that people keep thinking about.
Yeah.
Flexibility, speaks to what you were mentioning, which is you're doing X today. Tomorrow it may change. Who knows? 5 years from now, how things will be handled. And then resilience. We saw it over the last few years with health challenges, but also being able to see this massive shift in demand. Like if you were doing omni-channel and you were chugging along, and then all of a sudden you saw a 50% shift from one to the other, I'm sure that was painful for a lot of people. And then I think the labor challenges keep repeating. There was an article that I saw, not sure if it's true, but people at Amazon worrying that they may be running out of people to hire,
absolutely.
just because of the churn rate that they have.
Yeah, you go and talk to companies like McDonald's, right? It's not the production of food that is a problem for them. The only reason why McDonald's can't expand at the moment is people, right? So they have to do automation as well. They're getting to the point where how do we expand? Because if we don't expand, we die, right? The whole business model is based upon expansion. So and I think, you're so right. I can't mention how many people we're missing right now in logistics in various places, but we are missing people. And yet at the same time, because of digitization, we are attracting people. Because if we didn't have that, they wouldn't come to the work. It's so important. I think, in the future, you will get to a point where, you could have a stamp saying, this facility is operated with it could be InOrbit software, and people would say, oh yeah, because InOrbit is there, I know it's a good place to work because I'm not going to have to do all the heavy lifting that destroys my back. I got to work 40 or 50 hours a week, and I get a fixed pay, but I now am supported by something that really has been approved by, that's the sort of level. Actually, can I ask you a question on this? Because if you think of it where you are at right now, right? And the stuff you've gone through and what InOrbit has done, where do you see the sort of the big opportunities for you in the coming 5 years?
Yeah, look, I think we define our success by the growth of robotics industry, and what we're out to do is to maximize the potential of every robot. So what we see is as companies start to adopt robotics, they don't have the systems in place, they don't have the practices in place.
Right.
It's almost like a new labor force, but it's new and they don't know how to work with it. So I think as companies go from pilots to true at-scale deployment, they really run into a lot of growing pains. So I think that's where we think we can help. I like to talk about the 4 O's of InOrbit, so it's easy to remember. So it starts with observability, just having that real-time data. And again, not for each individual robot, but across a heterogeneous fleet, which is a big challenge today that we've tackled. Then it's optimization. How do you run better? And again, not just for one robot on one site, but for many robots, likely from different vendors across, thousands of warehouses, for example. And then you get into the higher level of orchestration. Sometimes you're going to have 2 robots that need to work together, right? So as humans, we work in teams. And I think our vision is that what you really need is a team that includes people and robots and then AI in the cloud. And that's where we come in. And then the last O is operations. So the robots are really smart, but they don't always run themselves. They have issues, they make mistakes, and being able to complement. And I really see robots augmenting people and in a way, people augmenting robots, and it's that collaboration that I think is super exciting.
I actually think that's such an important point. And in every digitization of every industry we've seen, right? We see all the ones that fail in this approach, and we can counter all the way back to Napster. We're just talking about music, right? But we go back to Napster and all the things, and where we landed up with Spotify. All of them. It's not business as usual. That's the most important thing. You cannot just take something and saying, okay, in my old thinking, I'm going to save 2 people in my warehouse or in my supply chain because I'm implementing a robot. No, what you do is you're actually increasing productivity, right, and you are now making a better environment. The problem is warehouse manager is being measured upon how much cost you can save. And that is the coherent, like, you have to change that business model. And DHL is doing that right now. It's a phenomenal difficult to do, by the way. It's not the technology as much as it is the sort of how do you change that business approach. And because the customer comes along and say, I just need you to save 20% of my cost. Right. That's all I care about, right? And so that's where we are at now with a lot of the things going on. And I think, when we look, and now I look at healthcare, it's the same issue. We don't have the resources. There are 36,000, in the States, for example, you're missing, in a couple of years, we're missing 7.8 million people in care. That's nurses and caregivers, right? Where are you going to get 7.8 million? Even if you wanted to, you couldn't import them. It's impossible, right? It's not an option. And even if you could, you couldn't, because it's not available, because everybody has this problem. And it's the same in the labor force in logistics and supply chain. And so you have to now think differently. And I think it's amazing to see people there doing it now. And I think that's the biggest change. If you look 5 years back, they weren't thinking differently. They weren't prepared to take these, but now they are. And the next 5 years, they will endorse it. It's a little bit like, I remember coming to the United States, and I came over to work for AOL Mobile. And when I joined, I came over because I built systems in Europe and exported them to the US, and they couldn't make them work. And I came over and I realized why. Because in the US at the time, this is early 2000s, everybody was using cell phones to talk. I was horrified. Why are you using cell phones to talk? Like in Europe at that point, this is before smartphones, still feature phones, we're using them for texting, for music, for playing games. Talking was not a cell phone opportunity. You had a feature called push to talk. Like, who came up with that stupid idea, right? It was taking 10 years back. And I honestly, I walked 10 years and since then, America has caught up with the world, thank God, right? It's now ahead of the curve in the cell phone business. But honestly, and it took American innovation to get there, and that's great. But back in the early 2000s, oh my God, just think about it. And that's what happened in logistics. They sort of got caught up by, the website, and the whole e-commerce thing was faster and smarter. They knew more about the customers than the providers of the services. Yeah. That's changing now, right? And you need automation, you need the robots, and you need to have that different approach to business and how you do business, right?
All right,
so that's crucial. Sorry,
I could talk for hours with you, but we promised we have some Q&A. So I want to save a couple of minutes at the end for any questions from the audience. So Diego, hit us.
Yeah, it's sad to interrupt this discussion, guys. But yeah, let's cover at least, I think I have 2 questions. One is related to, let me see, 1 second. Yeah, so it's related to the build versus buy usual question. So our company is reviewing whether to build operations software internally or buy it. What do you think our most important considerations should be?
I think, like in any other revolution or in any other, when I see migration or transformation, larger players will start off building. And that's just the nature of the game. It's always been like that. They will try out themselves. And that's right. Don't get me wrong. I think that's correct, because you need to get your hands dirty. You have to understand. But just like over time, the platforms that you can use, they become better and more optimized for your scenarios that you need. And eventually you just get to buy. I think the smaller players, it's impossible to build, quite frankly, because it's really complex. I think you guys know this more than anybody else, what it takes to get to the stage you're at now, and your vision, and as you were talking about, Florian, where you want to go. Those things the small players can't do, but the small players have a big role to play, obviously, in the future. I think one of the reasons why it's so interesting is that if you look at the world logistics supply chain markets, and DHL is one of the larger players, right? But even though they're the larger player, they are only still like they're below the 100 billion revenue mark. And if you look at other industries, you know, we saw yesterday, you know, Microsoft is now a $2 trillion company, and so, you know, and Amazon is one of the customers of these players. So it's very, the market is very fragmented. There's a lot of small players in it, and they won't be able to build. They have to buy.
Great. Look, regarding time, there's one more question I would like to cover very quickly related to interoperability, right? So a company that is mentioning that it has two different types of robots. How do we think about interoperability, and how does it make sense for enterprise to adopt different types of robots given this issue?
I'll let Florian go first on this one, and I will do a follow-up there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think interoperability is a kind of wonky word, but I think it's making all the pieces work together seamlessly, which is what every industry and every company aspires to. I think initially you see a lot of these silos have emerged, and there's some movement there now in the market, very early movement towards making the robots work together. And you can do that in a couple of ways. One is you can spend 7 years fighting over standards, or you can do it today. And there's solutions like InOrbit that handle that today. And what's interesting is that although every robot is a little different, you know, robots in a warehouse are doing, you know, well-known tasks. So it is possible to, you know, for example, for us to talk to any type of robot. And it still allows for the vendors to have differentiation in what they do, but they actually, by working together or by working in an integrated way, they're actually increasing the value of their own products. So I think that's a mental transformation from, you know, I think I'm going to be the only vendor in this warehouse, which, as Per said, ain't going to happen, to how do we, you know, grow the value that we're creating overall. Per, what would you add to that?
I totally agree with it, and I think we don't have the luxury of the phone industry had in '95, where they came together and very quickly created a global standard. Without a global standard, we wouldn't have smartphones today. Just let's be very clear about that. And we have a pending of other industries where we don't have that. One of the reasons why digitization is taking so long in so many industries is we still haven't found out what the format is of an address. Like every country has a different address, you know, and a different format, and we haven't identified those kind of those things. Like the only format we really have is a letter format or DIN A4, and that's a shape of a freaking paper, right? And then the data we put on it. Well, we still haven't gotten the standards, and a lot of the data is, and it won't happen for a long time. And that's why you need that's why platforms like Microsoft, Salesforce, Google, and InOrbit and others are going to do so well, because the world is going to stay complex. It's not going to change. I believe that the innovability is you have to sort of figure out that the world is constantly changing. What's today is the norm is tomorrow not longer the norm, and you need players like, for example, InOrbit and others to make that happen for you, because truly, without it, your business won't survive.
Guys, fantastic! Thanks both for this cool conversation around robotics, innovation, logistics, and everything else. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thanks, Per. Thanks, Florian. And see you next time.
Thank you for having me.